From the KMET Weather Center for Beaumont and the Pass area, partly cloudy skies this afternoon with scattered showers possible. High today at 59. Clearing and cooler tonight with an overnight low of 41. Tomorrow sunny with a high near 69. And Wednesday mostly sunny with a high of 75. For the Inland Empire today, partly sunny, light winds, high of 65. And for the desert cities, mostly sunny with a high of 80. I'm Rich Summers for Smart Talk 1490 KMET.
Take KMET 1490 AM with you everywhere you go by downloading our free smartphone apps found on the KMET website, KMET1490am.com. You can also go to the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store on your phone to download the free app. Now you can listen live or play any of your favorite programmers' podcasts using your smartphone. Don't miss out on the free KMET smartphone apps. Go to KMET1490am.com and download your free phone app today.
The Inner Voice Show is a dialogue between the host and the listeners about their relationships. This show is not an attempt to assess, diagnose, or treat any mental health or illness condition. Please consult your physician, psychiatrist, or psychotherapist for personal matters.
Inner Voice. A heartfelt chat with Dr. Foojan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inner Voice Show. I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine and have Sean in studio. This is a show about you, about what matters most in life, our mind, thoughts, feelings, actions, relationships, and our fulfillment in this beautiful journey of life. Now, in this show, I'll bring you the latest research about growing up high, a neurobiological consequence of adolescent cannabis use. And then I'll speak to Dr. Judith Grisel, a neuroscientist and an author of Never Enough, The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. It is an amazing book. I finished it going back to Rhode Island this past week and coming back, and I finished it and I loved it. And I hope that you guys will enjoy our conversation as much as I enjoyed reading the book. You can call us on the studio line, 951-922-3532, if you wanted to talk to Dr. Judith Grisel or I. Be sure to listen to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and share it with your friends. You can also go to my YouTube channel. Go to Foojan.com and you can go to both of them and be a part of it. Give evaluation, give rating, tell your friends, let us know how it's working. So, because we want to get better and better every day. All right, we'll be right back with the tip of the week.
Hello, I'm Dr. Foojan, and I have great news for you. I'm offering a special time-limited offer to anyone who's interested in online therapy or coaching sessions. I've developed the awareness integration model, which allows in only 12 weeks to raise your self-esteem and confidence and let go of your thoughts and emotions that produce depression and anxiety for you. So call today to schedule your online session and save $600. Call me today at 818-648-2140. That's 818-648-2140. Or go to www.foojan.com.
So this week, I've been pondering about the experience of freedom. It appears that when a person allows himself or herself to experience a new experience beyond a perceived constraint, the notion of being free is experienced. Now, freedom is experienced in the face of going beyond or resisting a restriction, constraint, or confinement. I've always wondered how different people relate or react to a particular way of circumstances or life situations. I've worked with people who were living in poverty and perceived living in freedom. Work with people who were wealthy, who felt restricted. Work with homeless people who felt free, living with no restrictions or bills. Work with millionaires who felt free, and with ones who felt burdened by the constraints of keeping up with the millions and the wealth and their image. I've seen people who saw their freedom in getting married, and the ones who felt restricted and jailed by being in a relationship. I've spoken with people who felt free by working in a company versus having their own businesses, and vice versa, with people who felt free owning their own businesses versus working in a corporate structure. And then yet I've worked with people who they didn't feel free until they were retired. I've talked to people who are in prison and feel free because they're taking a stance for an important purpose, while talking to people who appear to be free with all agreed upon standards of freedom, but they feel miserable and burdened and stuck. I've talked to people who used drugs and felt free by using drugs, and simultaneously they were restricted and addicted and jailed by it. So where does the sense of freedom show up? It appears only pretty much in their personal experience. So this notion of a felt experience of freedom is different from the laws and regulations that are set to limit or cultural factors that create constraints, which fall into agreed upon notions based on time and culture and circumstances. But the yearning to feel free is a human need. If this feeling comes from personal experience, then how can we create a perspective so that we can feel free inside with what is in front of us by choosing what is powerfully? Since it is here for us to deal with, resisting what is becomes burdensome and creates a sense of stuckness. Even the notion that we have a choice to create change comes from the illusion of freedom. So let's exercise the right to feel free, accept what is, and expand on what else is possible to vision and then act on it. We'll be right back with the latest research.
Join the conversation every Monday afternoon at 3 p.m. Pacific for Inner Voice Heartfelt Chat with Dr. Foojan. Dr. Foojan is a radio and TV host, international speaker, psychotherapist, life coach, and the author of Life Reset, The Awareness Path to Create the Life You Want. She brings you the latest research and interviews with experts in the field of cognitive sciences. Anyone who loves to grow and create growth for humanity gets a voice on this call-in show. Inner Voice Heartfelt Chat with Dr. Foojan. Monday afternoons at 3 p.m. Pacific on Smart Talk KMET 1490 AM and on KMET1490am.com.
Welcome back to the Inner Voice Show. The research is about raising and growing up high. So about 1 in 5 Canadian adolescents uses cannabis, 19% of Canadians aged 15 to 19, and its recent legalization across the country warrants investigation into the consequence of this use on the developing brain. I thought this would be good since California and many of the other states have also legalized it. And I work with adolescents who go through this and the parents of adolescents who go through this. So it was interesting to me, and I hope it is interesting to you. Adolescence is associated with the maturation of cognitive functions such as working memory, decision-making, and impulsivity control. This is a highly vulnerable period of the development of the brain, as it represents a critical period wherein regulatory connection between higher order regions of the cortex and emotional processing circuits deeper inside the brain are established. It is a period of strong remodeling, making adolescents highly vulnerable to drug-related developmental disturbances. Research presented by Canadian neuroscientists at the 2019 Canadian Neuroscience Meeting in Toronto on May 25th featured recent discoveries on the effects of cannabis on the adolescent brain. Dr. Patricia Conrad at University de Montreal studied a year-to-year changes in alcohol and cannabis use and cognitive function in a sample of adolescents consisting of 5% of all students entering high school in 2012 and 2013 in the Greater Montreal region, and a total of 3,826 seventh grade students. Yes, seventh grade. That is when they're starting to use. Students were assessed annually for 4 years on alcohol cannabis use, and their cognitive function was evaluated using computerized cognitive tests. The researchers found substance use to be linked to low cognitive functioning, a finding that could be indicative of an underlying common vulnerability. Cannabis use was linked to impairment in working memory and inhibitory control, which is required for self-control. Cannabis use was also linked to deficit in memory recall and perceptual reasoning. Alcohol use was not linked to impairment in these cognitive functions, suggesting cannabis could have more long-term effects than alcohol. More recently, Dr. Conrad's team analyzed the sex difference in cannabis response in the same sample of adolescents. Preliminary data indicated that cannabis use had a stronger effect on the memory functions of male students than female students. Both sexes were, however, equally affected by cannabis on inhibitory control. These results help identify at-risk youth groups and target them for early intervention and information. Dr. Stephen Levilotte presented research on the effect of the primary psychoactive component of cannabis, THC, on the adolescent brain in rodent animal models. His team demonstrated that adolescent exposure to THC induces changes in a specific region of the brain called the prefrontal cortex and in a brain circuit, a mesolimbic pathway that closely resembles the abnormalities observed in schizophrenia. Furthermore, adolescent THC exposure also caused affective, and cognitive abnormalities, including deficits in social interactions, memory processing, and anxiety regulation. Interestingly, his team found that administration of drugs that restore normal prefrontal cortex functioning in early adulthood could reverse the effect of adolescent THC exposure. Sometimes. They also demonstrated that co-administrating THC with drugs that prevent the THC-induced disruption in brain signaling pathways prevented the development of schizophrenia-like effects. These results offer insight into ways to prevent or reverse THC-induced brain signaling defects in adolescents. Dr. Iris Balodis from McMaster University investigated the mechanism that motivate individuals to act and make decisions that can go against a person's best interest, as seen in people suffering from addiction. To compare decision making in individuals suffering from cannabis addiction, also called cannabis use disorder, to healthy controls, Dr. Balodis used an effort-based decision-making test, which explores how much effort an individual is willing to make to receive a given reward. Participants are given a choice between an easy task or a hard task in which they can gain varying amounts of money. For example, pressing a lever or number within a certain time limit. During the administration of this test, they looked at differences in activity in different brain region by functional MRI. Initial findings suggest that there are differences in encoding the value of the reward, money received, and of the effort, cost, amount of work done in individuals addicted to cannabis relative to healthy controls. These were revealed by differences in activation of specific brain regions known to be important for motivation. Adolescent cannabis use is associated with behavioral changes related to reward and motivation in humans. Paradoxically, this use has not been suggested to increase motivation for other drug use. That's why they call it gateway drug. So it actually motivates adolescent to go and have more hardcore drug. And the potential amotivation syndrome, in which individuals are less willing to expend effort to receive a reward. It is not known whether adolescent cannabis use causes either of these responses, or if cannabis use is rather a symptom of a pre-existing state that results in these behaviors. Dr. Gibran Khokhar from the University of Guelph studied the effect of THC exposure in adolescent rats and their adult behavior. These rats also showed differences in other reward-related behaviors. These behavioral changes were accompanied by changes in the connection between different regions of their brain, including those involved in encoding reward and motivation. These results suggest adolescent cannabis exposure in rats can produce long-lasting changes in brain circuitry, which might contribute to the behavioral changes observed after cannabis exposure. So we're lucky because we're going to actually talk to the neuroscientist who wrote the book Never Enough, The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction, Dr. Judith Grisel. She is the author of Never Enough. She's a neuroscientist and a professor of psychology at Bucknell University. She has been awarded more than $1 million in federal funding to pursue research on the cause of drug abuse. Her work focuses on what in the brain predisposes people to addiction. And her recent work is focused on understanding the different genetic risks for addiction in men and women. I'm so honored and excited to have her. I love this book, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dr. Judith Grisel.
Hello, I'm Dr. Foojan, and I have great news for you. I'm offering a special time-limited offer to anyone who's interested in online therapy or coaching sessions. I've developed the awareness integration model, which allows in only 12 weeks to raise your self-esteem and confidence and let go of your thoughts and emotions that produce depression and anxiety for you. So call today to schedule your online session and save $600. Call me today at 818-648-2140. That's 818-648-2140. Or go to www.foojan.com.
Join the conversation every Monday afternoon at 3 p.m. Pacific for Inner Voice Heartfelt Chat with Dr. Foojan. Dr. Foojan is a radio and TV host, international speaker, psychotherapist, life coach, and the author of Life Reset, The Awareness Path to Create the Life You Want. She brings you the latest research and interviews with experts in the field of cognitive sciences. Anyone who loves to grow and create growth for humanity gets a voice on this call-in show. Inner Voice Heartfelt Chat with Dr. Foojan. Monday afternoons at 3 p.m. Pacific on Smart Talk KMET 1490 AM and on KMET1490am.com.
Have you ever wished you could just wake up one day, reach across your nightstand, and hit the life reset button? Let's face it, the struggles and frustrations of everyday life leave millions of women and men around the globe yearning for a new way. And the new way is right here in Life Reset, the awareness integration path to create the life you want by Dr. Foojan Zeine. You can get it now at Foojan.com or Amazon.com. Life Reset, the awareness integration path to create the life you want. You deserve it.
And now, back to Inner Voice.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine, and we have Dr. Judith Grisel with us. She's a neuroscientist and the author of Never Enough, The Neuroscience of Experience of Addiction. And I have got my finger on this because I got so much to tell you guys. I'm so excited. Welcome to my show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, I know that as I was going through, I love that you talk about your own experience and what got you into what you called like the favorite drugs, or whether it was alcohol or marijuana. I was really flabbergasted and kind of interested about how you had put some of the usage of some of the drugs and the personal experience you had and the experience that other people have in perspective. Was one of the guys, everyone who's listening and watching, this is one of the greatest book I've ever read that tells you exactly in details of what happens in your brain with each and every specific drug. It is so informative. And at one point, as I was telling you, Judith, that, you know, how we constantly look at things around us and we're like, yeah, but we don't know why. And I've worked with addiction for almost 30 years. I consider myself an addict because I was a smoker, a cigarette smoker for so many years. And I think I still have that type of an addictive mentality when it comes to food, no matter what. And your book explains so much. So I really am asking everyone who's listening and watching to read this book. This is a great book. What got you to want to explore everything that you had experienced as a person who had experience with drugs, and then as a neuroscientist, which decided to go and find a cure for this, and then you decided to write the book. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's I think began with my nature, which is naturally to focus on biology or on mechanisms. So some people are inclined to social explanations, and some people maybe are inclined to more psychotherapy kinds of explanations. But I learned that I was a drug addict when I ended up in treatment right after my 23rd birthday, having lost pretty much everything I cared about. I was homeless, and I'd been kicked out of 3 schools. My family wouldn't talk to me, and neither would many other people except for the police. So I was pretty desperate. And I guess when I heard that addiction was a disease, this was in the 1980s, I thought, well, diseases can be cured. So why don't I just get to work and fix this thing so I can use drugs the way I like to? I thought if I could find the switch that made me so crazy when I took drugs, which was basically every day for about 10 years, I would be able to use without self-destructing, sort of a social drinker or a social user of other things. And, it's funny because, as I said, I had no real promise, except I was very determined. So I ended up finishing undergrad finally and going to graduate school and then doing a postdoc. And really my aim was to explain what was different about my brain from people who were able to use socially. And so I was probably in about 15 years of that kind of basic research, publishing papers that not many people read, and, making teeny tiny headway, when it occurred to me, geez, maybe it's more complicated than I think, so it might be helpful to explain to everybody what neuroscientists understand about addiction. And then at least, I guess my view broadened. I think that happens the more we learn, the wider our scope gets, and that was the case for me.
And something that you just said, and I read it also in your book, and we experience it consistently, that is, there's always this bargaining that is pushed back. Like there's always this part that this is my best friend. This is what makes me joyous beyond anything else. So even if I'm going to live a healthy life, I'll just kind of postpone it. Like, I'll push it maybe at 70, maybe at 60, maybe right before I die. It's like this, we'll take this carrot and push it aside. And this bargaining aspect of addiction is very, very interesting that we all have. One of the questions that came up for me before we go, because you have an amazing hypothesis, that is one of those things that I said to everybody, is like, it makes sense finally. Somebody brought in conversation, which we've always seen, and it's like, yay, that's what it is. But you have done a lot of work in addiction with substances. Did you also find in your studies that addiction to behaviors such as gambling, sex, love addicts, even food, which is still a substance, but is a little bit different than the other piece. Did you find the same concept of brain activation with the dopamine and all of those that you found, or is it different?
Yeah, I think it's the same. And certainly in my case, I went through, I smoked cigarettes, and then, that was supposedly an okay drug. And then, that was also hurting my life. And then I was overeating ice cream and other things. And, I thought, well, this is better than cocaine or something else. So, and then really eventually realized this is not either the way I want to live. I think what characterizes an addiction, as you mentioned, is this denial that we have the problem. So it's the only disease I know of where you find out you have it and you think, no, not really, or not yet, or it's not that bad, or, people give up everything, as I did, and still refuse to see it. And I think that's what makes it so insidious and difficult to treat. And I think that all drugs of abuse, all substances work because they activate this core pathway of reward or pleasure or news. It's this mesolimbic dopamine pathway that lots of people know about. It evolved, as you suggested, to help us to do things that would forward our survival. So in the survival of our species, basically eat and have sex, reproduce, but also drink when we're thirsty, and things that we find pleasurable. So the drugs are sort of secondary to that. Now, gambling, taking risks, is for related reasons that are probably, it also activates that pathway. So I would say any rewarding or pleasurable experience, whether it's from a substance or a behavior, can be that way, is rewarding because of this pathway. And what happens, just like we get insensitive to insulin if we eat too many carbohydrates, or we can't hear the music if we listen to it too loud, so much activation of this pathway over and over again makes it a little bit deaf to pleasure and reward. And for that reason, we then have to use more. And the more you use, the more your brain adapts. So I would say that we do have an epidemic of addiction, not only substances, but all kinds of other things, maybe even the text updates, or, checking your email or Instagram or something.
Yeah, we're getting more and more with addiction with games for children, especially adolescent, and a lot more behavioral ones are showing up because of the fun that everybody has with the technology that is bringing up and boosting that part. There was an interesting part that I read from your book, which you mentioned that although everyone has been looking, but there isn't a particular DNA or a particular genetic factor to say that, oh, okay, this is the gene for addiction, and if we find it in someone, it has it. And you said that's not what you found or any of the studies found, although there is a pathway of hereditary, which there was a study that you said it was fabulous. When I read it, it was really interesting that even if you've had marijuana or drugs in your youth and you've never, and then after a long time, after even quitting, you actually give birth, that there is a higher chance that your children might become addicted. And they found that with rats. And it seems like, although it's hereditary somehow, because maybe it's behavioral or genetic, but there was never something found that you could say this is the gene. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure, I can. I was doing research and beginning my genetic research about the time that the human genome was cloned, around the turn of the century. And this was such an exciting time for geneticists and behavior geneticists in particular. We more or less all thought that knowing this DNA sequence would help us know who's going to be schizophrenic, who's going to be a genius, who's going to be a really fast runner, or very compassionate, or a drug addict, or whatever. And it didn't turn out that way. So the genetics of complex traits, the kinds of things we're talking about, anxiety or depression or intelligence or addictive liabilities, these things are really complicated. And it's not the case that if you took a bunch of addicts, and this study's been done many times now, and a bunch of non-addicts and compared their DNA, you'd find any smoking gun. So there are surely genetic influences, but they seem to be very many of them, and they're all contributing a teeny tiny amount either to increase or decrease your risk. So it's really statistically very complicated to parse those genetic influences. And I think some people think that if we get enough subjects, we'll eventually get there. And in some cases, we've had some promise, but really we've explained very little of the risk for addiction. or for any of the other things we've talked about in terms of genetics. We know it runs in families, as you said. Some of that might be in our sequence of our DNA, and surely it is. I shouldn't say might be, it will be, but it's little tiny weights, and balances. And then some of it might be in our, it certainly is in our experiences. So one way to, avoid addiction is to never pick up. That's sort of obvious. And the more you use, the more your brain is going to adapt to that using. So anybody can become a drug addict if they take enough drugs. But also maybe something is passed down on top of our genome, our epigenetic influences from the experiences that our parents and maybe even grandparents have. And in rat studies, as you suggest, rat and mouse studies, we're really seeing kind of a surprising ability of the parents' and grandparents' experiences to change the behavior and the risk of the offspring.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about the balance that the brain attempts to do and create homeostasis, and that's what our body usually does, and that's part of the hypothesis that you created. You wrote 3 laws of psychopharmacology. One is all drugs act by changing the rate of what is already going on. All drugs have side effects, and the brain adapts to all drugs that affect it by counteracting the drug's effect. And this is the third law. The brain adapts to all drugs that affects it by counteracting the drug effects. And then you have created a working model of a process A and process B. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, the model's actually not mine. I adapted it for my book, and other people have too. It was developed by 2 researchers at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1970s. And in a way, it's been a really important model for lots of addiction research. Essentially, the way we feel is maintained just like our body temperature is maintained and our glucose stores are maintained. These things are homeostatically regulated so that we don't get too high or too low. And in fact, we're sort of born with a set point. Some people are happy-go-lucky and they stay that way even if they have terrible experiences. And some people are, on the other hand, tend to be a little full of doom and gloom no matter how great things get. So we have this basic tendency. And of course, drugs are rewarding, as you mentioned, because they really increase pleasure. So they feel great, whether it's alcohol or Xanax or heroin, they all change our feeling state. But the brain needs to keep the feeling state level because otherwise it would not be able to tell if something good or bad happened. So if we were really inflated, let's say with heroin, so we went every day and we just got high as a kite, and then something terrible happened, a natural disaster or a child needed us or something, we wouldn't be able to tell. And so we wouldn't survive, and also maybe our offspring wouldn't survive, and that's not good for biology. So it has a way of counteracting that perturbation to make sure we're level. And that's, of course, the experience of every addict. Right. So heroin addicts, for example, are not using to get high, they're using to feel normal. Mm-hmm. Alcohol addicts don't really get high, they just don't feel so anxious and tense and irritable when they're a little bit in the bag. I'm caffeine dependent, which means that I don't wake up in the morning until I get caffeine, and then I feel normal. Without it, I feel less than normal. And all those examples reflect the brain's ability to counteract whatever drug it's expecting.
So one of the things that I got also from your book is people, depending on their personality and sometimes what they're missing, especially at a younger age, if they experience that instead of a skill, like if they experience anxiety, but they don't learn how to handle anxiety, if any of the things that they actually need and they don't have the skills to do it, and then suddenly they are introduced to some substance or a behavior that suddenly fulfills that part of them as if it's a skill. It's not, but as if it is. It fulfills that part of them, and then they get connected to that part. as if their life depends on it. And they will go toward whatever drug or action and behavior it is in order to bring themselves into a balanced mode. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the next part, you also said that when you utilize any of these drugs, which give you a particular experience, that your body also, which you call that an A process, that your system automatically also creates a B process. And please explain that.
Sure. So first, I think you made some good points in the beginning because there are some people who are more at risk for any addiction, and that has to do with that dopamine pathway, this reward pathway that's activated by sex and all drugs of abuse and food, especially chocolate and hot sauce, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
And there are differences in that. Some people have it naturally less sensitive than others, and if it's really sensitive, you're more prone to addiction. But it is the case that whether you first develop an addiction to alcohol or a benzodiazepine or an opiate or a stimulant might reflect differences in your neurobiology more broadly outside of that mesolimbic pathway. So people who tend toward alcohol and benzodiazepines tend also toward anxiety. And it makes sense because they can self-medicate. They drink alcohol and it's a relief because now I feel normal. I'm not so anxious. People who are naturally sort of pain prone are going to find opiates especially wonderful. And people who have an attention deficit disorder, naturally, we have a big variation in our society. Some people are more easily distracted than others. For them, a stimulant is going to feel like medicine. And so it is the case that there's a differential risk also. The A process is what the drug does to the brain. So an opiate or an alcohol or a Xanax or a Coke or meth all do something specific to the brain in a specific way. And I describe those as much as, I describe them, I think, in kind of detail.
Yes.
In an understandable way for each drug. So you could kind of get a primer on what is methamphetamine doing? How does it make you feel, less distracted and euphoric and all that? But again, the brain doesn't want to be kind of lifted out of its balanced state, and so it produces a B process. The A process is what the drug does to the brain, and the B process is what the brain does in response to what the drug does to the brain to counteract it. So for opiates, for instance, they block pain, they induce sleep. In the B process for opiates, the brain makes you feel more pain, literally puts you in pain, and makes you not able to sleep. It also makes you pant and have diarrhea and all the opposite things of an opiate. And so now when you're using, you feel okay. When you're not using, you just have this sort of unmedicated B process where you can't sleep, you're miserable, you're very uncomfortable. Your eyes are tearing because it's the opposite of the acute effect of opiates. So I think the core message is that whatever you take a drug to do, your brain produces the exact opposite state. And the brain is so good at adapting that it gets better and better at producing the exact opposite state. So you end up, unfortunately, spending money just to feel normal, but you can't get high. Or you can't really, you get the toxic side effects of alcohol without really the good feeling that you were going for. So in the long run, the situation with addiction is that you're unable to overcome the brain's adaptation. And you're in a place, I think, where you can't live with it because you're going to have an overdose, but you can't live without it because you're going to be in withdrawal. So It's a very narrow ledge and, kind of the exact opposite reason of why you enjoyed the drug to begin with.
Yes, that's part of the conversation I usually have with people who are in addicts. Like, this is freedom. We had a conversation about freedom earlier in the show. And I keep looking at them like, I'm sorry, the way I look at you or other people are looking at you, even for those 2 to 3 minutes that you appear, it is only an internal experience. And then you go through this jail and prison that, you created for yourself. And it's one of those diseases that it's the disease of the brain, which the brain is making decisions on the disease itself. So it's a very, very heart disease to be able to shake off. And it's one of those that it's not, most other diseases, the patient has some motivation up front. Like the minute they go into a doctor and say you have schizophrenia or Alzheimer's, I'm even talking about brains of the diseases of the brain or even disease of the body. When somebody goes to the doctor and the doctor says this is the disease, mostly people say, okay, give me how I can cure this immediately. Like, I don't want to spend my life in this. Just tell me how I can get rid of this. And the disease of addiction, it's opposite.
The brain is actually working perfectly in the disease of addiction. So in Alzheimer's, there's plaques and tangles. You look at a slice of a brain, it looks like a mess. Parkinson's, they're missing cells in their substantia nigra, and they can't get any dopamine. So these you can see pathology. In addiction, what you have is learning. And learning, the brain adapts. And so it's doing its thing, and it's doing it really well. And it's protecting you from these very high highs to make it more likely that you'll survive. But in the meantime, you then need the drug to even get by. And I think one good implication of that, unlike Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, is that because it's a functional response of learning, the brain can unlearn. If you were able to stay away from the drugs, that B process goes away. And so your brain readapts. So now it's not in pain without an opiate. It feels normal. If you were to take an opiate again, you would feel wildly high, of course, which is why so many people relapse, because they can't resist that wonderful feeling. But there's also many recovering addicts who've learned, unlearned their addiction and learned again to go back to the natural highs and lows, which in the long run, I think, do provide much more freedom.
Definitely. And your suggestion is also abstinentism. There's no bargaining on this, it appears, because the brain will not unlearn unless it is the type of the drug that it was using is not being utilized so that it can have enough time for it to unlearn. Did I get that accurately?
Yeah, I think there's some debate on this. There's not a lot of good evidence for people who were like me, completely out of control. And it's also because I started as an adolescent. So one of the things about adolescents you were just mentioning is that their brains are so plastic, they're so flexible, they're so malleable that increased flexibility increases the risk for addiction because it's increasing, it's better able to adapt. On the other hand, it's also better able to adapt the other way. So if you start become addicted in your teens or early 20s, it's almost an advantage if you can quit before you're out of your early 20s because the brain is still changing so much. So that could be an asset. But I think that, no, I just lost our train of thought. What was the second point of that?
It was more like, do they have to be abstinent for a long time before their brain can come back into learning a new ways of being?
I think from learning theory, it's much better to be abstinent. I suppose you could gradually teach it maybe less and less. I'm being theoretical here. So in my own case, I wasn't willing to take that risk. I think that the data support that most people are not able to go back to sort of a normal use, which is why I tell my students and my own children, if you can avoid becoming addicted, then you'll be able to maybe, have champagne at your wedding and not risk, a bit acting like a fool. I think that So probably abstinence is the safest way. And if you talk to a learning theorist, you know, the Pavlov's dogs, he would ring the bell and they would salivate. He could take those dogs away for years, raise them on a farm with a nice family, having a total normal life, never hearing the bell, bring them back at the end of their lives, ring the bell, and they would salivate just as much. So learning is probably the crowning glory of the brain. It is what the brain is uniquely wonderful at. And so we're not gonna, you know, it's so good at it that it's pretty hard to undo it. And it's very hard to undo it if you're occasionally dropping in a little bump of cocaine or something, you know, just on a sporadic basis. In fact, some learning theorists would say that would be an even stronger addiction.
Yes.
So it's
the intermittent reinforcement. It seems like it creates more of
right. Yeah.
So you have, as the chapters were coming to a closure, you were creating a wrap up of, is it biological? Is it genetic? Is it behavioral? Is it social? And for all of those, not only looked at the reasons, but also looked at, well, moving forward, if there are addicts who are listening to us, if there are family members of the addict who are listening to us, what is it their takeaway from your book in a conclusion of all that you have worked, not only experientially and experimenting with your own life, but also as a neuroscientist, which you did so many studies? What is it that someone who reads your book can take away beyond amazing, detailed information of the brain on every single drug? What is it that you wanted them to get after they read this?
Wow, there's a lot that I hope they take from it, but I suppose the strongest message would be that we are all in this together. If you are not the one dying under a bridge or in a hospital bed or in a prison from an addiction, you're affected by it because of your family members or your neighbors or your teachers or whoever. It is such an epidemic. 1 out of 8 adults in the U.S. has a substance use disorder, meaning they're addicted. And this cannot be something that the rest of us turn our backs on, because the brain is not causing, the brain mediates addiction. The brain is certainly the most proximal cause of an addiction, but it's not the only cause. The brain isn't acting in a vacuum. So we are affected very much by our relationships, by our social context, by the support we get from our friends and our practices, at our job. So all of these things, many people know, influence the tendency toward addiction and the ability to recover. But I think we are at such a state in the world, really, of such an epidemic of addiction. It's so tremendously costly that we all have to look at ourselves and see what we can do. And I think that the brain science actually bears that out, because we now know that the brain is modified. The structure and function of the brain is modified by the way we touch other people, and they touch us physically and psychologically, by our nutrition, by our sleep, by the kind of environment that we live in, broadly and narrowly. So these things are having a direct impact on the brain to contribute to, or maybe slow down, the tendency toward addiction.
It's a couple of things that was interesting for me in your book also was the conversation that you had not only about marijuana, which is kind of becoming legal in many of the states. And I know Colorado now, I think they're voting, and I don't know if it passed or not, but I think it passed for mushrooms and hallucinatories. And it's funny, that day I said it's funny because we're legalizing marijuana and hallucinatories, and we're delegalizing abortion. That was very interesting choices that we're having. But reading your book, also in the section that had to do with hallucinogens, LSD and mushrooms and all of that, it also brought up the conversation that it appears that they're saying this is not addictive, And there was this, and I've seen other neuroscientists as they talk about it, that it does not come across as the same negative impact. And that was interesting for me to also read that. Can you say a bit about, when we talk about all of these other drugs at the end, because of the addiction, it has the conversation of some negative connotation about it. And when it comes to LSD or some of the mushrooms or hallucinogens, there is this positive connotation around it. Can you talk a bit about that? Or maybe I'm mistaken, but I keep hearing that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I first want to say that I don't think laws have done much to influence the use anyway. So people use when it's illegal and they use when it's legal. I don't think that the way we can address this should primarily be through legislation. I do think, as you pointed out earlier in the show, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that THC is not only addictive, but causing damage to brains and to development in ways that are likely to have lasting impact on not only the individual, but on their communities. One of the problems is that we haven't done a lot of research on THC or on psychedelics. So I would say LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT, which is in ayahuasca, those are the psychedelics. Hallucinogens include things sometimes like MDMA, ecstasy in some cases, or ketamine, or belladonna, different kinds of plants. Those are sort of different. There's no known benefit for those, in my view. But the psychedelics, these 4 drugs, do have some, which have not been studied very much in the lab, do seem to me to maybe have some promise to help people. You know that Abbie Hoffman, who was the one who developed LSD while he was working in the lab inadvertently, and he became a huge proponent, and he said it was a medicine for the soul. And he felt like it gave people insight that helped them to make better choices in their lives. I think as a pharmacologist, those drugs are not addictive because they don't activate dopamine in this nucleus accumbens. They're the one class of psychoactive substances that are recreationally used, but that don't cause reward. Animals won't take them, generally speaking. They help people maybe have insight about their neuroses. And in general, we don't see the kind of harm to the brain or long-term harm to behavior that we see with all other drugs. So I think it's an exciting time. It's too bad he died. He died at about 102 after using these drugs his whole life. And so he's not seeing it, but we might be beginning to conduct the studies to understand better if they have any benefit.
And something that was really interesting and alarming, and I want to say to people, when you talked about all of the other drugs, you also said that with enough time that your brain is not on them, which kind of we're talking about abstinences, that the brain has the ability to come back and repair itself. And with MDMA ecstasy, that was not the case, as you had seen in studies. And that's very interesting. And I wanted people to know that.
Yeah, methamphetamine and MDMA, I would say, are the 2 most toxic to the brain. Alcohol is very toxic too, so I appreciate that counterpoint. But these drugs do a kind of a unique thing to the brain that may not be recoverable. So ecstasy, going back to the B process, which produces this wonderful feeling of connection and euphoria, the B process is depression and despair. The methamphetamine produces an increase in attention and alertness and euphoria, and the B process, the long-term consequences, are feeling a lack of energy and a lack of focus and a lack of interest. So it's always the opposite of the brain always produces the opposite state, and in those 2 cases, it may be permanent.
Yes, that's what I got. We only have 1 more minute, so I just wanted to give you the opportunity. If there's anything that you think you haven't said and you really, really wanted our listeners and viewers to know about, what would that be?
Well, I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, and I appreciate that clinicians and therapists and parents and children in some cases, and law enforcement. We're all working for the same goal of a society that is more free. And so I think it's important to have these conversations. And I hope that my book can help explain the neuroscience of addiction, and that people will write to me about their perspectives as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being on the show with me. And for all of you who are watching and listening, this is the book, Never Enough, The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. So please get it from Amazon. It's an amazing book. Everybody has to read this. And for just create an amazing life for yourself and everyone around you. And I'll be back next week. Bye-bye.
This is 1490 AM KMET.